This is another rant that's been a long time coming. In the 5 years that I've been doing reviews, every time I criticize a game about its controls or something that's in a bad way, I usually get someone giving the excuse of, well, if you get used to it, then it's good. That excuse works very rarely. I'll give you a few examples of where getting used to something works. The female Ghostbusters. After an adjustment period, you get used to it, and I think the casting looks pretty good. I'm reserving judgment, of course, until I see it, because that first trailer looked atrocious. But the second trailer was actually pretty entertaining, at least by comparison. And finally, the Sonic Boom redesigns. There's a what the fuck moment, but again, you get used to it. Getting used to those new castings or designs takes an adjustment period because we're seeing these iconic characters that we've known for years being replaced or redesigned from what we're used to. But then there's times where you can't get used to something. Here's a real life example. When I was in my sophomore year in high school, Missy Elliott's Get Your Freak On came out. I went to a trade school where half the year was academics and the other was your shop class. I was in electronics. So when we were working on projects, we could listen to music. Well, there was these two girls that would repeat Get Your Freak On back to back. They would kill it. That beat would give me a headache. And the more they played it, the worse my headache would get. There was no way I could get used to it. Repetitive beats like that give me a headache. I would take extra long bathroom breaks just to quell them. I did ask them not to play that song, and my request fell on deaf ears. And I didn't tell the teacher because he was one of those guys that would shut it down for everyone following one complaint, even if it was just one song. So you can't always say that you need to get used to something, especially bad controls when it comes to video games. I always say that you should just be able to pick up and play a game, and that you shouldn't need a bachelor's in how to play a video game. Everyone is used to X for PlayStation, A for Xbox, or B or A depending on the system for Nintendo to jump. Because on all controllers, those three buttons are all in the same location. It's the easiest button for your right thumb to press, followed by square, X, or Y for an attack. Left triggers for aiming, right triggers for shooting, and so on and so forth. If you're playing a platform game, an FPS, third-person shooter, there's a usual standard that we're all used to for all these games. But then there comes that one game that screws everything up, like Sonic Adventure 2's action button. How can you get used to it? You come to a trail of rings over a bottomless pit, and you either somersault or bounce attack to your death when you meant to do the light dash. That's the game screwing up a context-sensitive action. You can't get used to that. Or like how Star Fox Zero had an awkward control scheme due to Nintendo wanting to use motion controls. Or a game that I reviewed recently, Blood Rain. For a third-person action game, it uses first-person shooter controls. That was so weird to play a third-person action game as it was a first-person shooter. It's disorientating. It's saying, you know everything that you're used to? Well, forget it. The first American McGee's Alice was really weird for its controls too, because it was like a first-person shooter and its combat was pretty weird because of its controls. It wasn't that good of a platform game because of those controls. And keep in mind, Blood Rain and Alice came out during a time where games of their genre came out before them and did their idea a lot better. Are there games that can be the exception? Of course. Some games have complicated controls, but the gameplay is centered around that. I'm talking about games like Oddworld Abe's Odyssey. There's a lot of button combinations that you need to get used to and memorize because of the GameSpeak mechanic needed to lead NPCs to safety. Or fighting games, as a lot of characters control differently from one another. But then on the opposite side of the spectrum, Bubsy 3D controls like you put your hands inside the anus of an elephant and are using the rectal lining as a controller. If there's anyone on this planet, universe, or dimension that's used to the way that game controls, it's me. Because I've played that game a lot. More so than needed. And guess what? It's still a bad game, and that's not a subjective statement. It's a universal fact that it's a bad game. It's a game so bad that it killed off the Bubsy series. I've played it so much that I'm used to everything about the game. So by the logic of people saying that it's good once you get used to it, does that mean that Bubsy 3D is a good game if you get used to its controls? No, it doesn't. It's still a bad game regardless if you're used to it or not. A game can have bad graphics, bad sound, gameplay can be boring as hell, or the story is poorly written. But if it's functional and you're able to go through it without a problem, then I'll call it at least mediocre. Like when I was talking about Duke Nukem Forever, a game that everyone shits on. The graphics aren't that good for its time, the sound can be generic, gameplay can be repetitive, and the story isn't the best. But that's all subjective. The game itself is functional. You can pick up and play it just fine, at least on PC anyway. And that's an objective statement, because I never had a hard time because of the controls or any bugs. And that's all I ask for a game to be functional. I'll give it a bargain bin fodder or rental score if it at least works. But if I have to work around the controls or bugs, then no. Getting used to it isn't an excuse. It's a very weak way of defending a bad game. It's pretty much the go-to response for someone with no defense of their love of a badly made game. If you like a bad game, that's fine. We all have guilty pleasures. Just admit to it. Don't try to defend it by saying if you get used to it, it's good. You're not going to win that argument. In fact, it's a self-defeating argument, because what you're saying is that you had a difficult time until you got used to having to overcome the controls or bugs and glitches. But there's times when, yes, you do need to get used to the controls of a game or get used to certain mechanics. The Dark Souls games are probably a really good example of this. Dark Souls is a difficult game series. I tried the first one, and while I could pick up and play, I had a really difficult time because I had to get used to the controls. Not because I thought they were bad, but it was the way the game is designed. Another game would be the first Mirror's Edge game. The shoulder buttons in that game are used more often than the face buttons. While it's technically a platform game and you're used to a certain layout, you need to unlearn what you're used to be able to play the game properly. Clearly, this is a case-by-case basis. For example, let's take a look at two Sonic games. Sonic Lost World got a lot of complaints about its controls. However, the controls are not bad. The game just does a really bad job of explaining them, especially on the Wii U. The PC does a better job of explaining it. In contrast, we have Sonic and the Secret Rings. While the game explained the controls quite well, the problem was that they didn't really work, requiring you to work around them, either taking your time or just brute forcing your way through the game. So as you can see from those examples, we have 3 functional games with controls that break away from what we're used to, and 1 game with controls that are broken, much like every game that requires the Kinect. So before you say get used to it, ask yourself this: does a game actually work and function properly, or would fondling a fat man's hairy back tits be a better use of your time instead of playing a game that's shit?